What's going on, y'all? KM Best here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. In my mind, the metagame has really evened itself out recently. There's been a lot more diversity, especially at the top end, to the point that I think there are many decks you could reasonably describe as Tier 1, and there definitely isn't a Tier 0 deck in this metagame. There's a lot of different things happening. The general dynamic that has happened since the release of Anti-Venom is that Anti-Venom has pushed Luke Cage and Alioth style decks into the limelight. Those decks also tend to be running Pixie sub-themes some of the time, which means that there's a lot of damage that can be done to decks like Sera, the dominant Agent Venom deck. I'm gonna mess that up a couple times, I promise. The dominant Agent Venom deck, before this card came out, gets hit by Mobius. And of course, even Bounce gets a little bit hit by Mobius, and both of those decks very much don't like seeing Alioth. So the movements that the release of Anti-Venom has created have weakened AV, that in that case being Agent Venom decks, in a meaningful way. This means that they are much more on the level of the other decks people are going to be playing right now. For this reason, because I have the excuse to not start with an Agent Venom deck for the first time in weeks, I'm going to take that. This is Scream mid-range. It is, in my opinion, just a fundamentally fair and good mid-range deck that does powerful stuff. It is playing the world's most fair game, and I think the fact that I am able to start a tier list with this deck is indicative of just how much more even the metagame has gotten. When every deck was just exploding with power, this deck was not the choice. But now that those turn 6 explosion decks are being meaningfully countered by cards like Mobius, by cards like Alioth, the total amount of points in the average game of Marvel Snap is getting smaller and smaller. Not infinitely smaller, but a little bit smaller. And that allows a deck that's just a solid, good mid-range deck to really succeed. I will note that there are a couple flex spots here. I'm running Rogue and Nebula. Rogue is a nod to the amount of powerful ongoings in the meta, from Madam Web to cards like Iron Man and Claw, which are definitely not totally gone. Additionally, hitting stuff like Mobius and Luke Cage can be incredibly relevant against a lot of the decks that aren't playing the two aforementioned ongoing cards that target with Rogue. Now, Nebula, I think, is a little bit even more of a flex slot for me. I would play Rogue in this deck, partially because people don't really expect it. But Nebula can be Hydra Bob. It can be pretty much whatever you want it to be, honestly. A lot of people are playing cards that, you know, go in and out of the move package, like the fringy move stuff on the edge of it, like Silk. I have not enjoyed Silk because Silk is really bad in mirrors. But it's sort of, you know, hit or miss depending on what you're actually trying to target. It's not like Nebula's actually all that amazing. You can do a lot of stuff with that spot, but fundamentally what this deck is trying to do is just play good cards, curve out, and get extra value from when your good cards do the stuff that good cards do. If you are wondering what the major shell being used for the card Anti-Venom is, I think it would be fair to say it is this one. There are several options available to you with Anti-Venom, but this is probably the most played at the top end, and it is one of the better performing decks. And I think this is a good example of why it has been harder to be the kind of deck that Agent Venom wants you to be. Agent Venom, not Anti-Venom, wants you to be a very explosive turn 6 kind of deck. Anti-Venom, on the other hand, really wants you to do the same kind of explosion, but in a way that restricts your opponent's stuff. You have Mobius to prevent them from discounting their cards, because it also synergizes with your Pixie. You have Luke Cage, which allows your Anti-Venom card to get all of its power back, but also really prevents a lot of the Ajax-type decks from being highly successful. This means that this deck has a great amount of tech cards that are also combo pieces. And I think that's the fundamental thing to understand that makes this deck good, is that it has a Mobius that combos with Pixie, but Mobius is a good card anyway, and it has a Luke Cage that combos with Anti-Venom, but Luke Cage is a good card anyway, so its tech cards are also combo pieces. It is able to explode and take priority and play stuff that just like totally invalidates what your opponent is trying to do. Cards like Alioth are really, really good at that. And of course, even though it doesn't seem like the kind of deck that really wants to, it gets to pack a Shadow King, because some of the time you get that for free, you get some other stuff for free, you mix your costs around enough, and then you have an even more difficult matchup to approach for all of the Agent Venom decks. And this kind of deck being prevalent has really changed the equation for Agent Venom. Not that it's a bad card now, but that there are now other decks who are on the level of it. And that is the big change that this deck has wrought. Previously, Sera AV was farming the other AV decks. Now, Sera AV gets cratered by Mobius. And so you see way less of that and way more of Bounce. Not that you're not seeing it, but you really don't want to get cratered by Mobius, right? And so you end up with a very dynamic metagame. It has dramatically shifted, in my opinion. I am not going to sit here and act like this deck is somehow magically unplayable. I have tried multiple versions of this deck. They are all still very, very powerful. If anything this deck has going against it, it is the fact that everyone knows what you're doing. The entire world knows what you're doing, knows your range, and a lot of what normally gives Bounce value is, being able to be confusing on turn 6. Nobody's confused anymore. Everyone gets it. They gotta take priority, Cosmo you, Alioth you, what have you. They all understand it. You are not getting any sneak value out of this deck anymore. And granted, you weren't getting a ton, but it is dramatically decreasing in sneak value. Now, the increased prevalence of Mobius M. Mobius, thanks to people messing around with anti-venom, has really pushed one of this deck's major predators, the AV Sera deck, a little bit further down the tier list. Not that it's an unplayable deck, but it's definitely not the thing you want to be doing if you're afraid of running into a card like Mobius. There's a bunch of strong stuff that this deck does, and fundamentally, I still do believe that it sets the tone for the metagame. This is probably the best points package in the game. The issue is vulnerabilities, and the fact that everyone in the entire world is set up to exploit your vulnerabilities if you expose yourself in any way. This deck loses to random tech more than anything else I have played. This deck will randomly get Invisible Woman Killmongered, absolutely blown out, in a deck that isn't even necessarily trying to do that. This is still, despite the fact that I consider it maybe not the best deck, one of the best decks, and definitely one of the most targeted archetypes. I've actually been seriously considering just trying to get rid of Black Swan because there's so much Mobius in the meta. Just like get a Shadow King in there or something. It is genuinely difficult to deal with when there's just that much stuff, but I'm not sure I'm willing to pull the trigger on that just yet. The inclusion of Toxin makes our own Shadow Kings like a little bit worse in a non-zero amount of situations. And so I do think that I would probably end up running Shadow King here, but I'm not sure I can actually commit to that. This is the same deck that you remember it being. The only difference in terms of what I've seen out of move decks recently is that there is room for tech, right? We lost out on the Legion War Machine combo, so now we have a couple of empty spaces to mess around in. I've seen a couple of different things here, like Copycat is sort of the baseline instead of the Mobius. You have Copycat, you have Mobius, you have Luke Cage, you have Rogue. All of those are perfectly acceptable if you want to play in that spot. But I do encourage you to mess around with that spot because it is very clearly the biggest flex spot in the deck. And it's gonna be a lot of, picking what you want to try to target if you want to try to beat stuff, right? Mobius right now, I think, is like the most generally applicable. It's hitting the anti-venom decks. It's hitting everything playing Pixie, which is mostly anti-venom. It's hitting a variety of things like Sera, and it's hitting even some things like Black Swan, which can be meaningfully impactful because this deck tends to want to drag other decks down as well. Now, the other thing this deck has going for it, that it has always had going for it, is the combination of Madam Web, Cosmo, and Alioth, which can just absolutely end the entire life of any of your opponents. Downsides, however, are that you do still run the risk of not really drawing the right type of hand. You end up with these hands that are just like, I have like a Mobius and then some guys that move, and then no things to actually move with my guys, and that's really painful. When I play this deck, it almost reminds me of a combo deck. I feel like I should be snapping aggressively, but I don't think the deck is strong enough to reward you for that kind of snapping aggressively. But your good hands are so much better than your bad hands that I almost wonder if you're not priced into doing that. Another thing to keep an eye out for is people snapping into your Madam Web. Usually that means a rogue or a red guardian. Keep an eye on that, see if you can't maybe get priority, Cosmo that real fast. It is the kind of thing you're going to want to think of. To absolutely nobody's surprise, this deck is still quite solid. I do think that it has gone from being the best deck in the game to just one of the best decks in the game. Like, I'm still here talking about it like 5 decks in. It is still, in my opinion, easily a top 5 deck in the game. And a lot of what makes this deck so incredibly powerful is that it is just kind of impossible to play around all of what it can do. It is just a very difficult thing to deal with a turn 6 out of this deck. You have so much range in terms of what the possibilities are that it is difficult. It is very hard, unless you are vastly overpowering it, to ever get to anything but a 50-50. This deck is a factory of 50-50s, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, because a lot of those 50-50s aren't actually 50-50s. When you're playing against this deck, you might think it's a 50-50, but because of the sheer amount of points the deck puts out, it's actually not. This is a little bit like gambling, right? There's always a little bit of a vig. And so what may be a 50-50 in retrospect was not necessarily always a 50-50 in terms of the possible plays they could make. A lot of the time, what this deck manages to do is have, at worst, a coin flip, and often better than a coin flip. And the easiest way to explain that is to say it's often going to, it wins a lot. That's what I'm trying to get at here. The worst case scenario for this deck most of the time is a coin flip. That's usually a good thing. Like, a lot of decks love to get to coin flips. I notice when I'm playing against this deck that I'm usually happy when I take it to a coin flip. This is a very powerful deck that outputs a ton of power and has immense turn 6 range. I get it. It's a little bit, everyone knows about this deck. It's kind of boring. Don't let that fool you. It's still good. One of the single most common sights at High Infinite is just like a dude who's like ranked 3 to 500 playing Arishem. You see this like all the time. Like, it is astoundingly common to just run into rank 3 to 500 Arishem gamer and you have engaged the clown fiesta. I do think this deck is good. I personally am someone who really enjoys playing Arishem. I feel like it allows me to have a lot of freedom and do, unique and special things in this game. I understand that people don't really love it. Like, that's not necessarily how I feel about it, but I understand why they feel that way. Fundamentally, what this deck is trying to do, as it always has, is cheat. You want to cheat. And Arishem has gotten a little bit better as a result of this sort of metagame sort of contraction in terms of the vast amount of points you put on the board. When everyone was playing Bounce and Sera, those decks just do more points than Arishem. When I was playing Bounce into Arishem, it honestly feels a lot of the time that I can bully snap them. But Arishem did a couple things to adapt to that. Playing Professor X, playing Storm, stuff like that. That's very good. And the metagame has sort of pushed against those decks in a meaningful way. This means that Arishem now has a lot more mid-rangey decks to contend with. And Arishem is always at his best when that is what he has to deal with. Mid-rangey decks that are like playing relatively fair stuff, that's Arishem's bread and butter. He's there to be like the ramp deck to their mid-range and just be a little bigger and win as many of those games as he can. Which means the metagame has shifted in his favor, in addition to him adapting to some of the things that were beating him earlier. Arishem's a very solid card. This is a very solid deck. I will say, I do consider it nearly impossible for anyone to have, like, the correct Arishem list at this point. It's wildly difficult to figure out over the course of playing any of these decks if it had anything to do with the cards you were running, or just you got lucky in drawing those cards instead of cards that were randomly generated, or you got the right randomly generated cards. It's very hard to get a meaningful sample size on one card out of 27 in a deck like this that actually feels clear. So if anyone has questions about like specifics, I can talk in generalities. I like the Professor X stuff. I like the Storm stuff, but I don't really think I can get much more specific than that, because it's like, once you get into like, would you rather run Mockingbird or Shang-Chi, that just feels like, I feel like they're pretty similar in terms of how they play out, and I'm fine with either of them, and I don't necessarily have a cohesive argument for one over the other, because it is 1 out of 27 cards in your deck, and I'm never going to be able to play it enough to test it. Tens is about to get a big boost, so it's probably time to familiarize yourself with what it's trying to do. This deck is in a similar role, actually, to Arishem, right? Like, it's here to, like, be the big bully. What it wants to do is just go, boom, 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 I have too many points, nobody's playing Shang-Chi anymore, you lose because I have too many points. That's totally reasonable. That's a 100% perfectly reasonable play to make. Like, boom, boom, boom. This is a good, well-positioned deck right now. It does strong stuff. It has a Shadow King. It has a Cosmo. It has ways of preventing interaction. It puts a lot of points on the board. There's kind of a lot of debate right now as to what the best build is. I've seen some with Hood. I've seen some with Madam Web. I've seen some with a variety of different weird things happening, including War Machine, things like that. I am not 100% sure this is the best version of this deck. But what's really more important here is that all of this is about to get ironed out when Surtur comes out, right? Like, all of this. You notice there's a Psylocke in here. The Psylocke is so we can have a turn 3, 10 power guy. We are about to have that and not have to run Psylocke for it. This deck's about to get boosted to the moon. If you want to get familiar with it now, that might be a good idea, because Surtur looks like a completely ridiculous card. I feel, looking at Surtur and looking at Agent Venom and looking at what we have, I feel like that scene from Godzilla, where it's just like, okay, let them fight. In terms of weaknesses this deck has, you really don't want to get Mobius. Like, really don't want to get Mobius, because a lot of your points are very much on the board. There are 2 cards, like the 2-card combination of Mobius and Shang-Chi is quite difficult for you to deal with. You do have a lot of methods of stopping that. You got a Cosmo, you got an Armor, you got some stuff, right? Like, it's not the end of the world. But if you get Mobius, suddenly your turn 6 is almost infinitely less dynamic, because usually your 10s are on the board, right? When your 10s are on the board, you only really have Scar to play, and your opponent knows the Scar costs 6 because they Mobiused you. It's a bit of a tough time. That is one of the main things that I think people are going to want to be worried about going into the future. Wiccan's doing pretty well. I don't know who cooked this up, but I have always had a soft spot for Quicksilver Wiccan, and I think it actually is probably the right decision right now. What I like about this deck is it's incorporating elements of the tempo style deck with Daredevil and Negasonic, and I think this is the version that I see the most people in High Infinite on. I have no idea who put it together originally, and so I don't want to like give credit to people without actually knowing that, but I have really enjoyed playing it. It is a genuinely fun alternative here. And while it is a little bit mopey, I think the Daredevil stuff with Negasonic can really catch some people off guard. This is a powerful, explosive deck that, although it does have some issues in terms of like when it doesn't actually Wiccan, it can be a little bit iffy. But the power is here. The interaction is here. Daredevil and Negasonic are here. A lot of good cards are in this deck. And as far as Quicksilver goes, I honestly feel like, I'm not going to say he's proven himself as a card that can be top tier, but I do think this is probably like the 3rd or 4th or 5th tier list in a row where there's been a Quicksilver deck on here. And that is, I genuinely cannot say it enough, a shocking coup in terms of the Marvel Snap dev team. I didn't believe that they would be able to make Quicksilver good. When I had Jason on, who was the lead designer for that season, on my show, he mentioned that he wanted to try to make a card that made Quicksilver relevant. And I was like, well, everyone's just doing it with not Quicksilver. How do you really think that's going to go? And it worked out the way he said. Suddenly we are actually playing Quicksilver, which is just crazy to me. Discard is another deck that's benefiting from the relative decrease in overall points. Discard is not at its best in a metagame where everyone is racing to the top of their point ceiling, but it is at its best in a metagame where those decks are meaningfully being countered. Discard can do a lot of work right now. It's a very powerful, reasonable deck that a lot of people have access to that has a very large amount of point output. There is one pain point, though. In matchups where your opponent is likely to play Mobius, be very careful about your final turn swarms if you are trying to get a Dracula to hit specific things. Swarms have always been some amount of awkward in that context. Mobius and Mobius makes them so much more awkward. You do not want to be Dracula-ing swarms. That is an absolute nightmare. From the other side, I have won multiple games against this deck, forcing them to Dracula swarms with Mobius and Mobius. It is the kind of thing you're going to have to do. There are going to be some coin flips involved. As always, if you're playing discard, you just have to trust in the coin flips. That is why Gambit is in this deck. I do think Gambit is the right decision right now. Because we are in such a more of a mid-rangey meta, Gambit is often going to have meaningfully good targets at 2, at 3, at 4. It'll hit stuff like a Scream. It'll just be a really good card when it hits stuff like that. It can hit like reasonably good stuff a lot of the time. And I think that Gambit is probably the right call in discard decks right now, which again, a little bit indicative of this deck being closer to tier 2 than tier 1. But I think it's a really legit deck right now that is benefiting from the way in which the metagame has contracted. Tech Pile. It's performing amazingly. I am utterly shocked at this. This is a deck that I did a video on just yesterday. It's unbelievably good. Like, I can't really explain why it's good, but this deck being good is, again, a symptom of things getting contracted a little bit. If everyone was playing Bounce, there would be no way to play this deck. But right now, the metagame is so varied, and you benefit so much from being able to be the deck that uses your tech the best. This deck is excellent at manipulating priority, so whatever situation you want to create with regards to when you want to use your tech cards, do you want to use them after your opponent? Do you want to use them before your opponent's final turn? Are you trying to make sure you avoid Alioth or Cosmo, or are you trying to make sure you get the most value out of your tech cards? You can make all of it happen, thanks to the amount of movable power this deck brings to bear. And that's really the secret here. This is the deck that probably uses the tech cards, not necessarily best, but in by far the least predictable way. And I guess in some ways that does make it the deck that uses its tech cards the very best. I don't have anything against Sera. I think she still has the same good matchups that she used to have, but she does have a lot more bad ones now. It's hard for this deck to win through a Mobius, straight up. If your opponent is Pixie Mobiusing you, or anti-venoming you, or even just playing the card Mobius alongside like a normal game plan, this deck has some problems. Sera is very important to this deck being able to output the points that it needs. In addition, another bit of splash damage this deck is taking is that it usually is pretty reliant on having its points come from a card like US Agent. That's not really happening anymore because there's also a lot more loot cages running around. This is a deck that is built for a metagame that isn't right now. This deck is built for like hard countering the other two Agent Venom decks. And that is not what people are playing right now, and it has not meaningfully updated, and I'm not actually sure that it can because what people are playing right now is just so fundamentally brutal for a deck that wants to play Sera and US Agent in a world where everyone is playing Mobius and Luke Cage. The Toxic Sera deck kind of has the same problem, honestly. Like, it is, again, it's fine, it's good, it has more beef to it, and that additional beef can make things relevant. But again, you run into, when you try to lean into being an anti-venom deck by going into a toxic package alongside your Luke Cage, it's good. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it's not good, but it's so vulnerable to opposing Luke Cages. It's so vulnerable to opposing Mobiuses. And you just end up in very awkward situations consistently when you run into those cards. Outside of those cards, this deck just does a lot of really strong stuff. You will find yourself awkwardly sort of feeling around looking for your Luke Cage a decent amount of the time. I realize a lot of the time it's not like this, but in this deck specifically, I honestly felt like Ajax was my backup Luke Cage more than anything else. We don't have Luke Cage in every game, but I would love to have an Ajax, which is effectively Luke Caging, because then I'm getting at least some of the power back on Ajax, right? That is a shocking reversal. Most of the time, Ajax decks are Ajax decks. Right now, Luke Cage is king. It's the Husky Pile. If you enjoy playing Husky Puppies style decks, Hella type stuff, if you like rolling on dice, if you like large unaccountable units on the board, this is the deck you're going to want to play. And I think it's done well enough to justify its inclusion on the board, despite not necessarily ever feeling that incredible for me. It does have some meaningful power plays, and this is another deck that is really benefiting, again, from the fact that there's just not as many people point ceilinging the crap out of you with Bounce right now because people are doing other stuff. And this deck, don't get me wrong, it can really compete. It can't beat an Agent Venom draw probably, but it can beat a lot of other stuff. The deck has the ability to final turn play something like the Infinite and a Shadow King. So it definitely has game into Bounce in unexpected ways. The other thing this deck is really trying to do is get a Blink Electro or a Misery Electro and leverage that energy advantage in order to create variously large boards. I've seen other variants of this, like with Dr. Doom and Odin. I'm not entirely convinced by them, but it's not necessarily the worst idea on the planet at all. There is a lot of power here. I think the hardest turn for me is very often turn 4. If I don't have Electro, it's very difficult for me to choose between Jubilee and War Machine, especially if I have an Infinite in hand. I typically, it depends, do I have a Blink? There's a bunch of really contextual stuff that really informs that decision, but that has felt the hardest for me. The other thing this deck can struggle with is when you don't have an early game plan, you kind of just fall apart. If you're not doing stuff in the early game that is actually there, if your hand is just all the big guys and you sit on it and you cry, it's tough. It can get really tough. And that is the kind of thing that will happen to you a decent amount of the time when you play this. It doesn't look like a combo deck because it's not technically a combo deck, but it kind of is. The Darkhawk PF deck is still around, but ultimately I think its biggest failing is one of cube rate. This is a deck that has a good, strong game plan, but it's the kind of good, strong game plan where your opponent almost has no choice but to retreat. And so you end up creating a deck that leads you very often into situations where the only times they don't retreat are when they have a massive blowout and you get things reversed on you. This is a Galactus-esque deck in the amount of retreats that it forces. This is a wow, you're going to get a lot of 1-cube retreats out of this. Oh, you played a Black Widow and then snapped? Okay. There's a lot of retreats that come out of this deck. A ton. This deck definitely did take a hit, in my opinion, with the nerf to Rock Slide. It's not the end of the world. It's okay, but it did take a reasonable hit. I've definitely felt that. Zabu can alleviate it a little bit, but I'm not necessarily convinced that he's worth the slot. I'd be open to see if anyone else has ideas for what should be in that slot. It can be very helpful to discount that energy, but it feels like a decent amount of the time I'm just playing, a 4 and a 1 on 5 anyway, and it's all right, whatever, sure. And I'm not really getting what I needed out of it. It's possible, but it's not always the most likely. That said, you still have your nut draws, right? You still absolutely can, Black Widow, Misery, PF. You got it. It's hard for me to believe that this is a better than the Claw Agent Venom deck. I find it a little bit difficult to believe, but with the uptick in Arishem, there might actually be something here for not necessarily the first time ever, but it has been a long time since I've felt like the Darkhawk version of this deck has some real upside over the Claw one. It's not necessarily concrete, but I do think that this deck has a similar matchup spread and is no longer giving up as much after the nerf to Claw. Now, it's not the greatest thing on earth. There's still some really awkward draws in here. I'm not fully convinced of the doubling thing that this deck is doing, like Grandmaster and Absorbing Man have not really convinced me that that's what I want to be doing, but I will say that I think this deck has more room to succeed because AV has a little bit less of a target on its back right now. And so this deck is able to play a nice role with important disruption. And I will also say that rocks, I have felt like rocks are really good right now. I don't really know exactly how to explain it, but it feels like we're in a metagame where a lot of decks are playing all of their cards and every card matters. And so bricking a draw or 2 draws is actually very, very good right now, and that could also be a good reason to play a deck like this. A lot of good players really enjoy just pile of stats lists, and this is a pile of stats lists, so enjoy the pile of stats list. You can kind of guess what this deck is doing. You have your Havoc, and you have your Madam Web, and you have your movable Cosmo. This is like a pure aggro deck. This deck wants to play aggro. It wants to like establish a bunch of power and then be like, can you beat my power? Ooh, dare you enter my magical Cosmo land on turn 6? Do you know where he's gonna be? I don't. Good luck. It's pure aggro. I kind of really love decks like this. Like, if you're the kind of person who's just like gets a lot of good brain chemicals out of like stats going up and then a Cosmo stopping your opponent from doing anything about it, you're gonna love this deck. It is a much smaller ball version of the other AV decks, but that's fine. You can be small ball. It's okay to be small ball when you get this far ahead and are able to capitalize the way this deck can do. One note though, this deck can get really location screwed. Because it's a deck that really wants to like play for all 3 lanes a lot of the time, if you find yourself in games where one of the lanes is like inaccessible to you, which can happen from anything from like a Crimson Cosmos to a Sanctum Sanctorum, you're kind of screwed. That's just how it is. Along similar lines, this deck is doing much the same thing. I have found that small move package decks I haven't been nearly as happy with since the, not necessarily like meta revolution, but it has felt a little bit harder for this deck to justify itself to me. And I think that, you know, I'd rather just be the AV version here. I'd rather just be like the normal AV version, do my stats with the Havoc and all of that stuff. This is a little bit iffy. It high rolls very high. And when it high rolls high enough, it'll beat basically anything, but it still has, you know, some issues with, you know, various Alioth and Shadow King things, right? Everyone's playing Shadow King right now. You have the Cosmo. It is nice. I can't complain about it, but that's only 1 lane. And so you have these decks that are like anti-venoming you that can actually compete with you on points and also Shadow King your stuff. It's a little bit more difficult to make this deck make sense, and that's to say nothing of like the people playing Scream, which I actually don't think that matchup is that bad, but it doesn't feel good if you don't have the right stuff in hand, let me tell you that much. The old Stalwart Destroy manages to do its job just a little bit longer. It has maintained a 51% win rate at top 10% Infinite. I am so proud of this deck for just soldiering on through with that 51%. I've always sort of wondered at what point would I have to drop Destroy off, because even if it goes under 50%, it's still a deck people play a ton of, even if it's not all that good. This is a deck that is such a known quantity, that has such weakness to all sorts of tech cards, and has managed to survive all the same because so many locations are helpful for it, because it's such a generically strong, fair and good strategy that it has kind of a special place in my heart. I wish they would buff Destroy. What I will say is that typically the same issues that have plagued Destroy in the past are still plaguing it now. In order to keep up with what other decks are doing, it needs to high roll, and it needs to high roll early, which makes that even less likely. If you have your good opening hands, you are absolutely in the game against anyone. Very few people are going to be able to beat a 16, a 24, 32 power Deadpool. It's just not going to happen. That is only when you have those hands, though. And when you don't have those hands, you kind of just twiddle your thumbs and be sad. And that's sort of the tough thing about this deck, is that it has an almost combo-style element to the gameplay without the rewards in terms of cube equity that other decks with a similar requirement have. Mill has been performing decently enough at high infinite, I believe in the hands of Avazord and Fudge, actually. And I think it's worth putting this list on here because Mill, I think previously I've been pretty adamant, like, don't play this crap, and this list has actually been meaningfully refined. There's no longer anyone playing Null. It's just like actually mostly good cards. And I think what you'll see if you look close enough at this list is not actually a Mill list. What you'll see is a functional mid-range list that has a death in it, right? And every time I play against this list, the most dangerous thing for me is almost always like a 2-cost death or something like that. Like that, what this deck is actually doing is curving out in a really legitimate way, right? Like, Baron Zemo and Gladiator are like actually good curve plays right now. And so it curves out, it limits the amount of options you have available to you, and then it like plays a freaking 1/6 and a 12 power death and like something else, and you're just like, oh, I got mid-ranged right up until they went over the top of me. And so that is, I think, what the main thing I'd like to point out about this deck is, where it's like, it's solid. It's not actually unplayable. And what's happening here is A, the deck is getting refined, but B, those sort of mid-range games where that 12 power death really matters, those are more common now for all the reasons we've talked about throughout this video. All right, y'all, thank you so much for making it through that video. As always, I've been KM Best. Remember to like and subscribe. In fact, please like and subscribe. Thank you so much again. I've been KM Best again. You've been phenomenal. I'll see you in the next one.